Locked away in the shadows, how I escaped the cage they built for me. When my parents made me sleep in the basement while my brother lived like a prince, I had no idea just how far they'd go to paint me as the problem child. The truth was far more sinister, and it all started when I was 13. It was the night of my middle school graduation, a night that should have been filled with celebration. The table was set, my parents smiling in their usual forced way as they congratulated me for finishing middle school. My younger brother, Zane, was telling everyone about making the junior baseball team, his voice full of pride. My parents beamed at him, exchanging approving looks like they always did. Then, in the middle of the dinner, my mother casually turned to me, that cold smile on her face. "Ethan, sweetie, we need to talk about your room," she said, cutting into her salmon as though she were talking about the weather. "Your father and I have been thinking." She paused for a moment, making sure she had my full attention. "The basement would be perfect for you. You need your own space to focus on your studies, away from distractions," she continued, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. My fork froze in midair, and my heart sank into my stomach. The basement? I glanced at Zane, who was suddenly very interested in his mashed potatoes. Our basement wasn't some cozy hideaway, it was unfinished, with concrete floors and those buzzing fluorescent lights that never stopped. The only thing it had going for it was a small bathroom tucked in the corner, mainly used for laundry. I opened my mouth to protest, but my father cut me off, not even looking up from his phone. "We're converting Zane's playroom into his new bedroom. He's getting your room upstairs." He didn't even look at me as he spoke. "The basement will be good for you. You've been different lately, more withdrawn. This will give you the space you need to sort yourself out." Different? Withdrawn? I wasn't different, I was just quieter than Zane, more focused on my grades than baseball. But they weren't listening. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about a room. This was about something deeper. Something ugly. They didn't care enough to try to understand me. The basement wasn't just a room, it was the first step in what I now see was a carefully crafted plan to make me feel like the broken one. The problem child. Zane didn't notice, of course. He was too busy basking in his newfound glory. He didn't see what they were doing to me. He probably never would. But I saw it. And I felt it. And from that night on, my world started to shift, slowly at first, but with a force that would soon tear everything apart. The basement was cold. Always cold. The kind of chill that seeped into your bones, no matter how many blankets you piled on the bed. The walls were bare, with only the hum of fluorescent lights to keep me company. They buzzed endlessly, a reminder of how far removed I was from the rest of the house, from the rest of my life. But the basement became more than just a room to me. It became a symbol of my isolation, physically, emotionally, and mentally. At first, I tried to ignore it. I focused on my studies, determined to prove that I wasn't the problem my parents had painted me to be. But the more I excelled, the more I realized that no matter what I did, they twisted it. Perfect grades? He's obsessed with his schoolwork to avoid being social. A new project or research I was proud of. He's isolating himself more and more. Meanwhile, Zane was everything they wanted. He barely tried, his seasoned math somehow celebrated as proof of his well-rounded character, his passion for sports constantly lauded. Family dinners turned into showcases of Zane's triumphs while I sat quietly pushed into the corners of conversations. My accomplishments were barely acknowledged. Every time I'd bring up something I was proud of, my father would glance at me briefly and say, "That's nice, son," before turning the spotlight back on Zane. And the worst part? I started hearing things. Whispers when I walked into the room, quiet voices muttering about how I was different, how I was unstable. They didn't even wait until I left anymore. I'd be walking by and I could hear them through the thin walls. My mother's voice, soft but sharp, would drift down the stairs. "You know, Zane's just so well-adjusted. Ethan, well, we're giving him space to work through his issues." Work through my issues? I didn't have any issues. I didn't know what they were talking about. But I was beginning to understand something else. Their treatment wasn't random. It was deliberate. This wasn't just neglect. It was manipulation. They were shaping everyone's perception of me, creating a narrative that painted me as the troubled one, the one who couldn't fit in, the one who needed fixing. Before I share what happened next, the moment that opened my eyes to just how far they'd go, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button because this story is just getting started. The more I retreated into my studies, the more they pushed me to the edges. Family gatherings became painful. Zane was always at the center of it all, telling stories about his latest baseball games or his school projects. Everyone loved him. Everyone praised him. Meanwhile, I was either hidden away in my basement or dismissed with vague excuses. Ethan's just resting, or he's focused on his work, they'd say when relatives asked why I wasn't around. No one questioned it. Why would they? They had already been fed the story that I was the odd one, the difficult son. But I wasn't difficult. I was just trying to survive in a family that had already decided who I was. I began to see the bigger picture. My parents weren't just giving Zayn attention, they were building him up, and I was being torn down in the process. Every moment they celebrated Zayn, they were actively undermining me, making me feel like I didn't belong. And it worked. I started to question myself. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was the one who didn't fit in. Maybe I was the one who was wrong. But I was wrong about that too. I didn't need to fit in. I needed to find my own way, and that's exactly what I was going to do. I just didn't know it yet. This was just the beginning of the journey. The moment that would change everything for me was still ahead, and once I realized what was really happening, I would no longer be the silent son in the basement. I'd be the one taking control. The turning point came unexpectedly, like a crack in the foundation of my world that I could no longer ignore. It was a Saturday afternoon, the house quieter than usual. I was in the basement as usual, hunched over a pile of books, trying to block out everything else. But then I heard something. A conversation too muffled to understand at first, but unmistakably my mother's voice. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but it was impossible not to overhear. She's just so different, my mother was saying. Ethan's going through something. He's had these outbursts, you know? Anger issues, it's been getting worse. We're just trying to give him the space he needs, but I don't know how much longer we can keep it up. The words hit me like a slap. Anger issues? Outbursts? That was a complete lie. My heart raced as I strained to listen. But she wasn't done. And don't get me started on how withdrawn he is. He's isolating himself more and more. We've been patient, but I don't know. I'm worried. It was as if the floor beneath me dropped out. All the quiet whispers, all the subtle digs suddenly made sense. It wasn't just that they didn't understand me. They were actively creating this narrative, painting me as the unstable one, the problem, the son that couldn't be helped. My mind raced, unable to make sense of the sheer cruelty of it. And yet, there it was, laid bare. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to demand she take it all back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there in the cold, the words echoing in my mind like a dull thud. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to let them control my life any longer. They wanted to break me down? Fine. But I would break free. Before I share how everything changed, how I took my first steps toward freedom, let me ask you, my incredible viewers, if you've ever been trapped by someone else's lies, told you that you weren't enough. Drop a like if you've fought to prove yourself, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Trust me, the next part of the story will change everything. From that day forward, I made a choice. My escape would come from my own strength, from my achievements. My parents had written me off, labeled me as something broken. But I would prove them wrong. I would show them that I wasn't the mess they said I was the one who would rise above it all. I dove into my studies like a lifeline. Every hour I spent in that basement, surrounded by the hum of the lights and the cold concrete, became one more hour I used to escape my reality. My grades improved even further, and while my parents barely noticed, I knew I was building my way out. But I wasn't just studying for grades. I was studying for a future where I wasn't tethered to their lies. I started researching universities, looking at schools far away, places where I could finally start over, where I could be someone new. A scholarship to a prestigious university wasn't just a dream, it was my ticket to freedom. I would make it happen. And I would do it on my terms. Meanwhile, my parents remained oblivious. They were so consumed by Zayn's athletic accomplishments and their own image of the perfect family that they didn't see what was happening. They didn't see me transforming right under their noses. Zayn, of course, remained completely unaware of the tension that had built up between us. As far as he was concerned, he was the golden child, the son who could do no wrong. I couldn't blame him for that, he had no idea how deep the divide really was. But I wasn't angry at Zayn anymore. I realized he was just a pawn in their game too. They had carefully crafted him into their ideal son, the one they could show off, the one they could parade around as proof that they were perfect parents. And I was the sacrifice, the scapegoat. The one they could blame for all their failures. But not anymore. Not if I could help it. It wasn't just about escaping the basement, it was about escaping them. About taking control of my life, about finally proving that I wasn't the broken one. I would take everything they had thrown at me and turn it into the very thing that set me free. The plan had taken shape. My studies, my future, everything I'd been working toward, it all came down to this. Soon, I would be far away from here, far away from the lies, the manipulation, and the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. I didn't need their approval. I would build my own path, and they wouldn't be able to stop me. The basement wasn't a prison anymore. It was a launch pad, and once I was free, I would never look back. It had been years since I left. For years to be exact. For years of freedom, of building my own life, of finally shedding the weight of my parents' expectations. I had worked hard to get here, graduating from college with honors, landing a job at a prestigious tech company, and building relationships that felt real for the first time. Gabriella and I had made a life for ourselves, and it was everything I had ever wanted. But as I stood in front of the door to my childhood home, my parents' house, the place that had once been a prison, I knew this visit wasn't going to be like any other. It had been too long since I'd spoken to them. Our brief interactions over the years had been strained, awkward. They never stopped asking me if I was sure about my decision to stay so far away, hinting at the idea that I still wasn't quite stable enough to be on my own. And then came the message. Connor, my younger brother, now a shadow of his former self, had tried to contact me repeatedly, telling me there was an emergency. The text was urgent, panicked. "We need you. Something's wrong. Please." My heart skipped a beat, but I had no idea just how far things had fallen until I arrived. When I opened the door, it was like stepping into a different world. My parents, who had once seemed so untouchable, were now a far cry from their polished, Instagram-perfect selves. Their clothes were disheveled, their faces haggard. My mother, once the picture of poise, looked broken, her makeup smeared, her hair undone. My father, the man who had once towered over me, seemed smaller now, shrunken. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his own failure. And Zane? He was there too, standing awkwardly behind them, looking lost. They weren't the family I had left behind. They were desperate. They were broken. "We need your help, son." My father's voice, once so commanding, now trembled. "We've lost everything. The business, the house, it's all gone. We have nowhere else to turn." I stood there in the doorway, looking at them, feeling the cold rush of everything I had built in the years since I left. Part of me wanted to slam the door, to walk away without a second thought. But another part of me, the part that had spent years being manipulated, underestimated, and cast aside, knew that this was the moment. This was my chance to take control once and for all. Before I made my decision, I turned to Gabriella, who had been standing behind me, watching the scene unfold. She gave me a look, a mix of disbelief and support, and nodded subtly, as if to say, "This is your call." I let out a long breath and stepped inside, my mind made up. I wouldn't let them off easy. They had to face the consequences of their actions. "We'll talk," I said, my voice cold and calculated, but on my terms. I could see their hope flicker for a moment, and Zane, who had never truly seen the extent of the damage, looked at me with confusion, maybe even a hint of anger. He didn't get it. Not yet. He hadn't had to live through the years of being erased, of being painted as the bad son while they adored him. But it didn't matter. They had to learn, and they had to learn the hard way. "I'll help you," I said, my voice steady. "But only if you agree to a few things. First, you will publicly admit everything. Every lie, every manipulation, everything you've ever said about me to family and friends. You'll confess on social media. You'll take accountability for all of it." My mother's face crumpled, her eyes welling with tears, but I didn't flinch. The truth had been hidden for too long. They had no right to expect any more from me. "Second, you will get therapy," I continued. "I'll pay for it, but you will go, and you will face everything you've done, not just to me, but to yourselves and to each other." They stood there, speechless. My father's lips quivered as if he was about to argue, but then he looked at me, really looked at me, and saw something he hadn't seen in years. Control. Power. The power I had taken back, and now I was handing them a choice. A chance to make things right. "And lastly," I said, with a cold smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, "you'll live in my basement. The same rules you gave me. You'll stay there, and you'll prove to me that you can change. It'll be your space to sort yourselves out. The same way you thought I needed to." There was a long pause, thick with disbelief. My mother tried to speak, but no words came out. Zane's anger was growing, and I could see it in his eyes. But there was no going back now. "Take it or leave it," I said, turning to walk out. "Those are my terms." They huddled together, whispering urgently. I could feel the tension in the air, the years of resentment, the years of manipulation, all building up to this moment. And then, after what felt like an eternity, they finally agreed. They moved into my basement. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same basement they had sent me to all those years ago, the place where they had tried to break me, was now the place where they would face their own consequences. The next few months were a strange mix of satisfaction and cold resolve. Every day I watched them struggle, watched them adapt to the terms I had set. My mother, once so polished, now had to work through her own feelings of guilt and shame. My father, too proud to admit his mistakes, had no choice but to confront the reality of what they had done. Zane, he came to visit once. He stood in the doorway of my basement room, the space I had once been confined to, looking at me with resentment. "You really did this to them, didn't you?" he asked, his voice laced with anger. I looked at him, and for the first time I felt pity. "You'll understand someday," I said softly, my gaze steady. "When you see it for what it really was." He didn't reply. Instead, he turned and left, disappearing into the world that still saw him as the golden child. But for me, the work was done. They had started to change, slowly. The therapy was helping, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that the basement wasn't just where I had been kept. It was where they would now have to face the consequences of their own lies. The truth had finally come to light.